Right, we'll start talking. You all have been asking what book I used for this class, and here I wrote it on, first week I wrote it down, but some people have come and joined us, so. It's called Jerusalem, One City, Three Faiths by Karen Armstrong, 2005. So I was gonna give you a quiz this morning. I'll give you the answer later. The quiz is, does anybody know what happened on July 15th, 1099? Huh? What happened on July 15th? You're a smart guy. July 15th, 1099.
My memory isn't that good.
Okay. You were here, but you don't remember. Come out in today's lecture. What happened on that date?
Was that calendar the same calendar that we have now?
Yeah.
Does that help you get to the answer?
The second-
This, maybe something could pop up.
No, it's not when they caught up. That's not when they caught up 2 weeks for the leap year that they missed. Let me see, let's start with prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for this gathering today. We thank you for the spirit of your holy city of Jerusalem. Thank you for the lessons that that city teaches us, and pray that it would enlarge our faith and broaden our understanding of what a great God you are. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Welcome, everybody. We're in week 3. There's plenty of room at the table. But that's all right. They're box seats, but they don't cost any more. We're in week 3 of a 4-week series where we are just whirling through Jerusalem, the history of Jerusalem, in 4 weeks. And so, it's 1,000 years a Sunday. It's a massive undertaking, but last week we ended up studying Jerusalem until the destruction of the Second Temple, 70 CE, by the Romans, and that's where we pick up today. And we're going to go through the Crusades, and then we're going to make it to the Ottoman Empire when they took over the city in the 15th century. And then next week, we're going to go from the 15th century to modern times. And what I hope to do a little bit, I'm not an historian, but I hope to set up the mess we have in the Middle East right now. Where did this come from? And it's a mess. And it's been, many fingers have been in the pie, and they have messed it up royally, and we're still in that mess today because of decisions made. And that's next. We'll worry about messes.
We can blame the British on that.
And the French. Well, but that's okay. We'll get to that. Okay, the Second Temple was destroyed by the Roman army, guided by Titus. Anybody been to Rome? Anybody been to Rome? Have you seen the arch to Titus in the Roman Forum? You see the menorah in it? It's right on one of the legs of it, the menorah. They are celebrating in the arch to Titus in Rome. They're celebrating everything they brought back from the temple, the Second Temple to Rome. And one of the things that stand out, because not all the golden things make sense to me, but the menorah, you can recognize the 7 candles. The temple was a heap of rubble. For the second time, God had failed to intervene to protect the Jewish zealots in the Second Temple. All that was left on the Temple Mount, the Mount of King Herod, was a portion of the western wall of the Devir. The Devir is D-E-V-I-R, and that's what we would call the Holy of Holies. Part of that wall got left, and that's it. So what did the Jews do? They worshiped that wall because it was all that was left. Now, that's not the western wall that they worship today. That's something different. We'll get into that next week. But they worshiped whatever was left of that temple, and all that was left was a fragment of the western wall of the Devir. For centuries, the temple had stood at the heart of the Jewish world, and it was central to the Jewish religion. Once again, just like the Babylonian exile, it had been totally destroyed. And up till today, it has never been rebuilt. There has been no temple. on Temple Mount since 70 CE. The loss of the temple was a profound shock to the Jewish people. For some, life had neither value nor significance. This is the Bible. We're not gonna use it anymore because it's all, it stopped, it wasn't written. We think the last thing was written in the nineties. CE, so it doesn't help us go forward, it stops. But the Bible was being written when the temple was destroyed, and there's not a word about the temple being destroyed in the Bible. In the New Testament, why not? Why not? Why didn't, it was a big event. To the Jews, it was catastrophic. Christians don't even mention it. Why not? Why not? I think you know the reason, huh?
It's Paul's fault.
It's Paul's fault. Well, we can blame everything on Paul, which is convenient but untrue. I don't know if it's Paul's fault or not. Paul was leading kind of the Greek Christian movement,
Right, that
and the
makes-
Jewish Christian movement was stuck in Jerusalem. And so he was not there, but he certainly knew about it.
Sure.
And he was Jewish, and he
He
certainly
was trying to get away from
okay,
that
and why?
Jewish.
Why?
Well,
Well, what are they getting
to
away from?
build the bigger tent, I suppose,
Okay,
and broaden the scope of, the word.
okay, all right.
If you're gonna worship a temple
Yes.
rather than God,
Okay,
why would we put that in the Bible?
okay, all right. Okay,
Because it was a big deal.
Well,
And
that's a big deal.
it was a big deal, but we don't mention it. Why do Greek Christians, basically the writers of the New Testament, not write about the destruction of the temple in 70 CE?
So faith wise, like when Jesus told the woman at the well, it's not gonna matter if you worship on this mountain or that mountain. That soon you're gonna worship the truth and spirit. So they didn't need a temple anymore. And like in the temple, it was believed the presence of God was within the
Yes,
temple.
yes,
Like literally in the
Literally.
bread of the presence, literally in the temple.
yeah,
Now he lives within us and in our bread, the community. And so there's that faith reason, and it's politically, the Greeks probably were pretty tied to the Romans. So
They were.
responsible.
well, yes, yes.
Byzantium was more important.
Jesus predicted that the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed. And what was going to replace the temple? Jesus himself. So the Christians were concentrating on Jesus. And they didn't care about the temple. The temple didn't mean anything anymore, because Jesus was the way to God, not the temple was the way to God. I mean, that's the way I would answer it. I don't know if there's a better answer or not. But I think that's one of the reasons why they just didn't bother with it. It wasn't important to them like it was to the Jewish faith. Titus's army was not done. They smashed the elegant mansions in the upper city, pulled down Herod's beautiful palace. The destruction was so complete that the piles of debris that they knocked over completely filled the Tritonian Valley. There was a valley that went on the west side of the Temple Mount, and they just filled it in with trash. Pushed the whole city just into that valley. The city walls were completely demolished. It was difficult to see that Jerusalem had ever been inhabited. The Roman victory was so complete that it continued to be a source of pain and humiliation for the Jews. 81 CE is when that arch of Titus was built in Rome. So it's 11 years later that arch was built in the Roman Forum as a celebration of Titus's victory. And today,
Did stuff like
they did, well, they honored their.
that. Salted the fields of.
We're getting to that, we're getting to that, it's really early, but we're getting to that. So let's jump ahead, I've got more stuff than I could possibly cover today.
The other thing about that, why they, don't mention it,
Yeah, okay,
the Bible wasn't written on the day that happened.
No.
Or it wasn't written, it wasn't assembled.
no,
I mean, to me, one big idea about the whole enterprise is that later, the powers that be in the church decide what goes into, the documents, right? And what documents we we get, and therefore, you know, it was thought about, I'm sure that that was talked about quite a bit.
There's a hidden book somewhere.
There were several.
Hundreds of
There's lots of writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I just think it was some editor.
Some bishop editor kept marking.
Yeah,
I'm gonna jump ahead. Emperor Hadrian became emperor of Rome in 118 CE. So we jumped ahead to 118. He wanted to consult, and yes, this Hadrian is the same Hadrian that you hear about Hadrian's Wall between England and Scotland, the same Hadrian. He wanted to consolidate the Roman Empire. That was his job. He wasn't into expansion, he was into consolidation. So he went and visited the major cities in the empire and gave them a gift. And the idea was now you would love the Roman government because they gave him something. His gift to the people in Jerusalem was the worst gift you could ever give Jewish people. He was gonna build a temple to Jupiter on Temple Mount.
oh,
And that was, I mean, how often have you heard, defiling the temple or the Temple Mount made the Jewish people mad? So, and then he kind of, he renamed the city. If you want to make people mad, rename your city. He renamed it Aelia. Capitolina. It was no longer called Jerusalem. Emperor had renamed it. And this is a reference to his own name, Hadrian. This is a reference to Jupiter. And so, the Capitoline museums are in Rome today. I mean, it's kind of a historical fact. He went even further. He prohibited Judaism to be practiced in Judea. So no circumcision, no ordination of priests, no teaching of Torah, no public Jewish meetings. The Jewish people felt they had no choice but to fight back. They formed an army and fought back. It was led by Simon Bar Kokhba and Karen Armstrong describes him as a hard-headed, practical soldier who led the troops in guerrilla warfare, and the rebellion lasted 3 years. That was it. Hadrian sent one of his best generals, Sextus Julius, and the army systematically swept through Judea and retook the city of Jerusalem in 135 CE. After this war, the Jews were banned from Jerusalem. So that's when the diaspora really started. The Jews couldn't live in Jerusalem, or as it was known then, area captivity. So they go where? Do you know where they go? Some of them go to Galilee. And they just go up, 100 miles north and hang out there. And some of them go to other countries, and some of them go elsewhere, but they are banned. Think about that. Jewish people being banned from Jerusalem. So how long were the Jews in control of Jerusalem? From 1000 BC, when David took it over from the Jebusites, to 135 CE, which is 1100 years. And in that period, they had David and Solomon. Solomon built the temple. They had the Assyrians come and take away the kingdom of Israel, but left Judah. The Babylonians came and took away the kingdom of Judah, and then they returned 70 years later. Hezekiah built a temple. Then the Greeks came through in 300 BC. Then the Romans took over in 62 BC. And the Romans got rid of it in 135 and sent it all away. And they moved all. It's
Beginning of the Jewish diaspora.
it is,
Yeah.
but it started before, but this is when it became complete. They had no city to live in. So let me tell you two quick stories about Jewish fights, though, because it's interesting. The Romans were into power, strength, armies, killing, and the best thing that the Romans had is if you didn't get along, they would kill you. I mean, that's their ultimate punishment that they had. Death was their ultimate punishment. Pontius Pilate was gonna put pictures of Zeus on Antonia Fortress, which was right on the north side of the Temple Mount, and you could see it from the temple. So if you're visiting the temple, this is Pontius Pilate, so this is early in the first century. You would see pictures of Zeus. Well, the Jews got mad, because that defiled the Temple Mount. And so they formed a group and all went out to Caesarea, which was the capital of Palestine in Roman times, where Pilate's governor, where his palace was. And they all went out there. And they were mad that he was gonna put up these pictures of Zeus on the wall of Antonia Fortress. So he said, everybody get in the amphitheater. And he surrounded the amphitheater with soldiers. You know what he had in mind. And he put everybody in there. And he said, if you all don't go away peacefully, I'm gonna kill you all. And you know what the Jews did? All of them. They pulled down their shirts, turned their necks, and said, kill us. All of them said, we'd rather be dead than to have our temple defiled by Zeus. Pilate was amazed. That act of civil disobedience took away his only weapon, which was death. If they're not gonna respond to death threats, then where is his power? He was impressed by that. That this little sect of Jews located in a faraway country far from Rome, living in Jerusalem, had that much of a love for the Temple Mount. They were willing to die, sacrifices, kill us now. And he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. He was impressed with their bravery and let them all go. The other story I was gonna tell you about, also from Karen's book, is Hadrian's story. Hadrian had to take back the Temple Mount, and Sextus Julius did it, brought in a legion, 10th Legion, and they took back the Temple Mount. Whenever the armies returned to Rome, the emperor would stand in the open place and would say, our armies are victorious and our armies are well. That's what they would always say when the legions returned from victorious campaigns. Hadrian, after fighting the Jews, said, our army was victorious. Stopped. They had killed so many of the Romans that the army was not. The Jews were notorious for fighting to the death and fighting viciously, especially when they were defending the Temple Mount. It's interesting that they had that reputation even before the Romans. So Aelia, the city of Aelia now is an entirely pagan Gentile city. The Romans built a new city wall. The 10th Legion left Aelia in 289 CE. Jewish Christians were also dispersed in 135 CE. You know, Jewish Christians, they were Jews, so they had to leave. And they spread out. Jerusalem had no special status to Christians. Christians were anxious to transcend devotion to temples, shrines, and holy mountains. Because that to them sounded like paganism or Judaism. Christians looked at Jerusalem as the guilty city. The guilty city. And it was guilty because it rejected Christ. John the Revealer, the revelation to John of Patmos, you think happens in the 90s, maybe, in the 90s. That revelation was read more than any other scripture in the 2nd century to the Christians. Everybody thought it's gonna happen, we better get ready for it, it's happening now. We're still waiting. We're still waiting. So let's jump ahead to Constantine. Next great emperor. In 312, Constantine defeated his imperial rival Maxentius in the battle of the Avilian Bridge and attributed his victory to the God of the Christians. The next year, he declared that Christianity was one of the official religions of Rome, not the only, but he added it to the list, to all the pagan beliefs as well. Constantine's hope was that Christianity would become a cohesive force in the Roman Empire that would bring it together. He had kind of the same dream Hadrian did. How are we going to solidify and make everyone support Roman authority over this empire. Christians suddenly became interested in locating Golgotha and the tomb of Jesus. They had to do that. So this is 300 years. 280 years after Jesus is dead. And Christians now started saying, we need to find where Jesus died. We need to find where the upper room was. The upper room was important because that's where Christ inaugurated the Eucharist, the Last Supper. That's where Christ appeared to the disciples after his crucifixion. We hear about that this morning if you haven't already. That's the sermon topic. And it's where they got the Holy Spirit from. So the upper room to them was important. The upper room we know is up in here. They said, this is Golgotha, in the tomb, they said was right underneath that, and they built,
Sepulchre?
well, I mean, they built a church, but I guess I'm trying to get over the fact that Christianity said, we don't need a temple, and then they found a temple. Christianity said, we don't need buildings, and then they built a building over a sacred spot, and they went to it, and it attracted pilgrims from all over the world. It's amazing how our religion is tied to monuments, mountains, and buildings.
How many people have made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem?
And how many people have gone to Jerusalem to look at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Yes. We did exactly the same thing we made fun of the Jews for doing. We made an object a sacred place.
But they are Jews, or they were,
Yes,
they come from Jewish descent.
yes,
so
they do.
it was in their DNA almost, that
It
they
was.
needed to have that.
But even the Greeks.
And now we've
even
been
the
for
Greeks
two
did.
thousand, it's in ours, you know.
It's in ours too. It's in ours too.
So is this the case where Constantine's mother picked the spot?
Helena, yes.
Yeah.
She came, I'm looking for, she was, yes, Constantine's mother came in 326, and so soon thereafter. And she came to come to the Holy Land to find all the sacred spots. And so she said, so where was Jesus crucified? And they all said, here. Where was he buried? And they said, here. Where was he born? And they went to Bethlehem. They said, here. But that wasn't the big one. You know what the big one was with Helena? She found a piece of wood from a cross and said it was the true cross. Oh, that exploded all over Western Europe.
Yeah.
Every cathedral in Western Europe wanted a piece of the true cross. And so they had to carve that thing up into 1,000 little slivers and send it all over Western Europe. That true cross thing caught everyone's attention. And it spread like wildfire. Now, maybe we don't see that now, but back then, when she said, here's a piece of the true cross, and supposedly the story is she found 3 crosses.
I just heard
In a
about
ditch.
that being somewhere, I don't
Yeah.
even remember where. But
Yeah, there was
piece
a-
of that wood.
And she
Yeah,
took,
that's
she
something.
touched all, she had, some of it was ill, touched all 3, and when they touched one, they were healed. She said, that's the true cross. And this
There's
is,
also, bones from the Buddha's finger and
Oh,
all over China, there's a whole bunch of things like
well,
that.
yes, we're good at spreading,
Right.
yeah,
Well,
spreading holy relics everywhere.
So the holy relics, as I understand it, churches wanted them because pilgrims would come and they could collect money. Yeah,
And
attraction.
yeah, Dorset actually.
the robe and the crown of thorns are supposed to be, you know, this stuff gets made up, I think, half the time, 3/4 or
There's a lot of myth here.
Yeah.
Oh,
There's a
yeah.
lot of myth here. Constantine never came to Jerusalem. But his mother did. And that visit was an incredible visit. And she found the cross. Wow, what a detective, I mean. So Christian pilgrimages to the tomb of Jesus began, and they started building the church. Golgotha was a little hill and the tomb was nearby, and they could build a church over both. Originally, they built a church over the tomb first, and left the hill, and then later, crucifixion started to grow in importance in theology, and they built a church over there too. It's called either Anastasia, Anastasia, which I think is Latin for resurrection. Or the Crusaders called it the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that's the name we know. That's the name it's known by today. And you can go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today, it's right there in Jerusalem. They will let you in,
I understand they rebuilt,
and they're rebuilding it, but they need to, it's.
yeah,
Yeah,
when I was there, it was,
it's,
I don't know if I'm gonna get down there underneath them.
I think they're spending a lot of money on
Yeah.
rebuilding it. So a subtle switch was made in the Christian theology. Instead of calling Jerusalem the guilty city, they said the Jews were guilty and the city was holy. It's interesting how when you start to make holy places inside the city, you have to then declare the city holy. And so they made a very subtle shift and moved it away from the city and more onto the Jewish ethnic group. I guess let's jump ahead another 300 years. The king of Persia came through in 614 CE. The Byzantine Empire, which is Constantinople, Turkey, it got weak. And anytime a country empire got weak, the Persians were ready to come in. Roman Empire had gotten weak. And so Jerusalem got taken over by the Persians in 614. When the Persians left, they placed the Jews in charge. So they brought the Jews back and said, "You're in charge." But unfortunately, the Persians returned 2 years later. The Byzantine and Persia armies fought each other until both armies were totally exhausted. In 622 CE, they made a peace treaty, primarily because they couldn't afford to fight any longer. So guess who came into the vacuum? What year was that? 622. The Muslims. Here comes the Muslims.
Oh, yeah.
They come into the vacuum at that point. Muslims began their military campaigns in 633, when they saw there was a power vacuum as Persia and Byzantium were both exhausted. The Jews hated the Byzantines, so they invited the Muslim armies into Palestine. It's interesting how they make a lot of allies. Jerusalem fell to the Muslim army led by Caliph Umar in February 638 CE. Now we jump ahead to 630. Jerusalem was under Muslim control. They renamed it. Of course, you have to rename the city when you conquer it. Al-Quds, Quds, which means the holy. Why did they care about Jerusalem? The reason they cared about Jerusalem is there's a strange story in the Quran that says Muhammad one night was taken on a horse with Gabriel, the angel, and went from the nearby mosque, which everyone interprets as Mecca, to a faraway mosque, which the Muslims interpret as Jerusalem. He apparently went to the Temple Mount and put his foot on the rock at the Temple Mount, went up into heaven, and went through the 7 layers of heaven and got to see God. And his footprint is in that rock.
Wow.
That's why so Jerusalem is one of the 3 holy sites for the Muslim faith. So you have the Jews with their history of the temple and being the chosen people in the promised land. You have Christianity, who believes in Jerusalem because that's where Christ died and was raised from the dead. And then you have the Muslims who believe Muhammad made a 9th journey to the Temple Mount and went to heaven from that.
So that's where the mosque is now?
No, okay,
Blue,
that is the Dome of the Rock.
Right.
Now, the Dome of the Rock is the gold dome that you
Yeah.
see now, it's still there, 1600 years later, it was built in the 6th century. The Dome of the Rock is not a mosque, it is a museum, it's a monument to this rock, to where Muhammad. The mosque is on the Temple Mount, but that's on the south side, where Solomon's portico was, and that's called the Al-Aqsa, AQSA mosque is. So there is a mosque on the Temple Mount, but that's not the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is merely a museum. And they go,
And there's nothing to do with Abraham and,
no, well, I mean, no, except if you talk to Muhammad, he may say that he was trying to direct Judaism and Christianity back to a simpler Abrahamic type of religion. Kind of simpler religion, yeah, where there wasn't all the
politics, yeah.
either tapestry.
Big country politics.
So, you know, some biographers of Muhammad, and this is just Karen Armstrong's words, said he wasn't trying to create a new religion, he wasn't trying to fight, he was trying to correct what he saw was wrong with the two religions of Palestine.
Let me see if I got this straight.
Okay,
Muhammad went from Mecca to Jerusalem.
on a horse, one night, yeah.
That's one hell of a horse.
It was a great horse. The name of the horse was Barak, Buraq, and he went with Gabriel, the angel. And so he had an escort. That's what got him into heaven. It's Gabriel. Yes, it was quite a trip. It's quite a trip. Jerusalem is not named, as I understand it, not named in the Quran. It's just the remote house of worship. It's all it's said, and they just say, "Oh, that's got to be Jerusalem," and we know that because I don't know how we do that. It just,
We built the Dome of the Rock. You can make that.
and so the Temple Mount, when the Muslims took over, was a garbage heap. Everybody had used it just to dump their garbage in. In fact, there's a story when they opened up the gate to go to the Temple Mount, some of the garbage fell out into the street. It was a mess. They cleared the Temple Mount, built a mosque on the southern side, which I told you about. The remote mosque stands today. The governor repaired the city's walls and gates and started building the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount in 688 CE. It's still there today. Still there today.
It looks like it was built yesterday.
Well, it's been repaired several
Yeah,
times,
yeah.
and renovated, yes,
So,
and the Crusaders did some damage to it. Herod's supporting walls for the temple platform had to be repaired, but their stones that they used to repair it were small stones, and Herod's stones were huge, heavy stones. So you go to the western wall today and look at it, you see Herod's stones going up 25 feet, and you see these little stones on top, that's the Muslim additions on top to support the Temple Mount, which is, what did I say, 35 acres, it's a huge open area. I did not know that Palestine had lots of earthquakes, but apparently they do. They had a major earthquake in 747, others in 771 and 813. There were constant religious tensions in our kids between the Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Each one of them, imagine this, each one of them, once a religion has the tendency to say that we are the one true religion, they tend to exclude or diminish the other religions. And all three of these have claimed to be the one true religion at one time or another. And so they just constantly fought back and forth. Even within Christianity, there were divisions between Latin Christianity, which is Roman Catholic Christianity, which is Western Christianity, which was governed by Rome, and Eastern Christianity, which was Greek Christianity, which was governed by Constantinople. And there was even a Pope in Rome and a Patriarch in Constantinople. Anybody want to tell me about the Great Schism in 1054? Doesn't have anything to do with it. That doesn't involve Jerusalem, but I think you need to know what happened in 1054. It's later, the Crusades are later. The Great Schism in 1054 is when the Greek Orthodox Church, and this is funny, the Patriarch excommunicated the Pope, and the Pope excommunicated the Patriarch. And the Greek Orthodox Church went separate from the Roman
That was
Catholic.
a result of the sacking.
No.
The Crusades got lost.
Oh, yeah, the Crusades,
But.
the story lost its face. And I think that's later. And I'll tell you why I think that in a second, because we're getting to the Crusades.
So we learned all about that last summer. This last week. Yeah.
Okay, the schism,
Yeah, we learned.
okay, good, well then you all
We
know
learned
about.
about two schisms.
And actually, the dates do move around, but most historians pick 1054 as the date of the Great Schism. And I'll just tell you, primarily it was because the Latin Catholics added the phrase to the Nicene Creed, the Holy Spirit was from the Father and the Son.
Yeah.
And the Greeks said, no, the Holy Spirit comes from the Father only, not the Son. Boom. The two churches split over that issue. So does that sound familiar?
Yep. Yeah, we learned about the other schism.
Well, let's just jump ahead to the Crusades. I'm running out of time, which is fine. Pope Urban II, 1095, addressed the clergy, knights, and poor people of Europe, and preached a holy war of liberation. 1095. So this is after the schism. Greeks didn't join in this. And that's important. The way the Muslims treated the Greek Orthodox Church was different than the way they treated the Roman Catholic Church. The Crusades was all Roman Catholic. In fact, it was almost all Frank Knights, which means the Franks were the knights that came over in the First Crusade. So Pope Urban II said the knights should stop fighting one another in pointless feudal wars. They were tearing Europe apart, and they should march to Jerusalem to liberate the tomb of Christ of Islam. Those words were magic. When he said we need to liberate the tomb of Christ, every knight said, I'm ready, let's go. And they just formed armies and left and went. He said there would be the peace of God in Europe and the war of God in the Middle East. It's interesting how he just said, we are going to take back the tomb of Christ. And where was the tomb of Christ? Well, it was in Al-Quds, controlled by the Muslims. So the response was extraordinary, widespread, and immediate. In the spring of 1096, 5 armies of about 60,000 soldiers set off on the road to Jerusalem. Most of them died in Eastern Europe. Most of them didn't make it. But then a second army joined them of 100,000 as they marched to Constantinople. They were all impressed by the passion for Jerusalem. The Crusades were grim, frightening, dangerous, and expensive. And it became apparent that the victory of Christ would be the death and destruction of others. Some of the armies massacred Jewish communities in Europe on the way. This is kind of where anti-Semitism kind of took hold in Europe. Why? Because the Jews were guilty of rejecting Christ. That's the reason. And maybe they sacked Constantinople when they got there because it was a different religion, and it was a different that was the Eastern side.
Does she talk about a big mass by the Eastern Church?
And I don't have every page written in these notes. So the Crusaders went through 3 years of unimaginable hardship to reach Jerusalem. The siege was slow. They had never seen stone walls like this in towns in Europe. Europe didn't put up stone walls. They put up wood. And you just burned them or knocked them down. They ran into Jerusalem and there was these high stone walls. So they had to take some ships apart and they used the wood from the ships that they dismantled to build these siege engines to attack Jerusalem. And they attacked Jerusalem. Godfrey's army was up here, and a soldier from Godfrey's army breached the wall on July 15th, 1099. And the Crusader armies went through that breach. And I have intentionally ignored the massacres of Jerusalem in the past. They're in the book and they're all over the place. The massacres, to me, are not important to be taught in an adult Sunday school class, and they really don't say anything. But this massacre was outrageous. You have Crusader Christians going into a city, killing everyone. Arabs, Muslims, Jews, there probably were some Christians there. And they let their bodies rot in the streets. It was awful. There was a guy that went there 5 months later, William of Tyre, and he said, there's still heads laying on. There's still arms laying around. There's still legs laying around. They never cleaned up the mess. I make a point of that. It took them 3 days to do this. They went through the whole city and slaughtered everyone. It was terrible. The massacre was a sign of the triumph of Christianity, they thought. And they thought, those Crusader soldiers thought that the world would celebrate this holiday every year from then on. It would be like Easter or Christmas. July 15th, 1099, and today, none of us had known that date. That date means nothing to any of us. That's the day they breached the wall and then in Jerusalem killed everyone. They headed right for the church. And when they saw the tomb of Christ, which was in the church, they broke down and cried. That's what they had come to free. That's what they had come to liberate. And there it was. But what was the plan after? There was no. The plan was to go to Jerusalem and kill everyone, but then they had no plan. And then they were in a city surrounded by Muslim armies and couldn't even be resupplied. The port was, I don't know the distance from Jerusalem to Jaffa, but probably 70 miles. And so they created this little government in this little city that had no plan for it. It was really kind of strange. They did do some building. They renamed the Dome of the Rock on top of the Temple Mount to be called the Temple of the Lord. They put a cross on top. They covered up all the Quran inscriptions and they put Latin scriptural texts on them instead. They did get to expand their territory a little bit. The caliphate that was surrounding them, the Muslim caliphate that was surrounding them was weak. So they did expand a little bit. They went north to Caesarea, Haifa, Jaffa, Tripoli, Sidon, and all the way to Beirut. So they had a little country, middle of Muslim empire. They started an intense building program. The armies of the Second Crusade arrived in Palestine in 1148 to relieve the beleaguered Franks. The Franks were done. We're heading. We've done our job. But the Muslims were starting to unite and get ready for a return. The Muslims were commanded by, this is not his Muslim name, but we call him Saladin. That is the Western name for the general. And his title in Islam, in Arabic, means the righteousness of the faith. In 1174, the Crusaders were surrounded by the United Muslim Empire. And they lost Jerusalem in 1187. When Saladin was marching towards Jerusalem, he said, "I'm going to kill every man, woman, and child in Jerusalem, just like the Crusaders did when they entered in 1099. And the leader of the Crusader army, got his name here, Baron Valiant of Ivalon, and I don't know where Ivalon is. He went out and he said, 'Please have mercy on us.' And Saladin kept his word, and not a single person was killed in taking over Jerusalem by the Muslim army. I find that just incredible. The Crusaders killed everyone. And 100 years later, the Muslims win the city back, and they don't take revenge. It is, the Saladin is a legend for doing it. And in fact, he says that, he's quoted as saying, "Christianity will always remember that I didn't kill them when I took over Jerusalem." And they did remember that. There were even rumors that he was a secret Christian. There was even rumors that he had been baptized. Probably none of that is true. Isn't that interesting that we want to use our religious morality to explain an enemy's show of mercy when we didn't show mercy when we took over the city to begin with? It's just it's a strange. The Sultan kept his word. Not a single Christian was killed. Saladin has been quoted as saying, "Christians everywhere who remember the kindness we have done them." Christians in the West, that's Western Europe, were made aware that this Muslim ruler had behaved in a far more Christian manner than ever on the Crusaders. They remembered back stories they had heard. The Crusader experiment in Jerusalem was almost over. There were other attempts, but some of them died in Egypt, some of them made it to the coast. Richard the Lionhearted brought over a crusade, but he never made it off the coast, never made it close to Jerusalem. The Crusades were a 100-year victory, 100-year campaign. It was 100 years of just a footnote. It really, they didn't do anything but a footnote to history. Where we are. There was a second crusade, like I said, that was led by a third crusade led by Richard the Lionhearted, then King Philip II of France. Of course, he's famous because Richard the Lionhearted is famous because of the legends probably. The Muslims were very defensive. The Crusaders stayed on the coast, and as long as they were on this was the Muslims' first contact with Western civilization. And what it was a massacre. It was an army that came and killed everyone. And they were very defensive of that. As long as the Crusaders were along the coast, they weren't sure what was going to go on. They eventually went home. Saladin died of typhoid fever in 1194. There was a seventh crusade led by King Louis IX of France, but it was stopped in Egypt in 1250. So all of these crusades kind of went to 1099, 1250. And they were all, the first one was only partially successful, the rest were just dismal failures. Now, the Arabs weren't much better. They continued to fight among each other. I mean, they weren't much better. The French were pushed off the coast in 1291. So for the first time in nearly 200 years, the whole of Palestine was in Muslim hands. Matters improved in Jerusalem, except in 1351, Black Death reached Jerusalem, killed a lot of people. So the Black Death of Western Europe came down and struck Jerusalem as well. And then the Ottoman Turks of Asia Minor come, and the Ottoman Turks take over Jerusalem on December 1st, 1516, so we made it 1,500 years today. They took over in 1516, and there was no opposition, they just walked in. Nobody put up a fight. Nobody put up a fight. So what did we go through today? We went through Roman occupation. We went through the dispersion of the Jews and the Jewish Christians. There was a time when Constantine was in charge and Rome still held on. The Roman Empire, I always think of it as kind of, this was the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. And every time an army wanted to attack the Romans, they would push in. And there was some time that the Persians came and took Jerusalem back from the Romans. Then the Romans sent over an army and pushed them back. I mean, this eastern frontier just kind of went, it was always moving like this. It was never peaceful. And Jerusalem was in the middle of that. It just went back and forth. Then after Rome, we have the Muslims. Actually, we have the Persians, Byzantines, and then we have the Muslims. And the Muslims have held on to that land for 1,500 years. I only raise that because the Jewish nation says we're entitled to this land because God gave it to us. And the Muslims say we're entitled to this land because Allah gave it to us. And the Jews were there 1,100 years. Muslims have been there 1,500 years. What gives somebody the right to take land from somebody else? What is it that controls that? And the answer is, it'll come next week, but the answer is the United Nations. That's what happened. But we'll get there.
48 or 47?
40. Well, I mean, independence was 40.
Yeah.
The United Nations may have made the decision in 47. But,
But even before that, the British made decisions after World War I.
yes,
Yeah.
and we'll get to that too.
Yeah.
Because all of this, Zionism really started way back in the 13th century. Zionism being the Jewish desire to return to their promised land, to return to Jerusalem. It started in the 13th century. Why? Because they were spread all over the world. They had been kicked out of Jerusalem. It grew in the 1800s. It became a movement in the early 1900s when the British were in charge of Palestine. So that's next week. That's next week. And then we'll get into 1948, which is now. It's 75 years ago. We're still killing each other.
Yeah.
Well, a decision was made by the UN at that time.
Big time. Blades.
Thank you all. Thank you. Come back one more time. If there's one more, then I can get to. A lot more in my notes.